Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm also here with Scal. Scal, thank you so much for joining me. Put that pommel away. Right.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure, and it's well overdue that you're on the channel. This is part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, you will find it on Scalagrim channel. I will link it down below. So this is a discussion talking about edge damage on historical swords, a topic which I think we've both talked about in the past, haven't we? But I think it's always good to revisit these things, and there's always new information and new evidence coming to light. So we talked in the previous video about why edge damage happens on historical swords, the fact that it did happen, and the fact that you can find it on original swords, but not perhaps as much as you might imagine. So you came to me with a question, didn't you, Scal? What was that question?
I did. The question for this very edgy topic is there a bias amongst museum curators? Because whenever you visit a museum and look for signs of use, there's very little. Every now and then you might see a nick or two. At least I've seen very little so far. So do they keep the good stuff behind in the back, in the storage?
Yeah, and you know, as with many of these things, the answer is not a simple yes or no. You know, every museum's different, and every museum came about in a different way. So I think I sort of explained in the previous video that what we find in museums basically split into 2 types, by and large. There's other types as well, but the most common types of things you find in museums are the things which have been there, that were basically came into the collection in the 19th or early 20th century and have been there for a long time, and they're generally quite well looked after things, or things in some cases that were found or discovered before, let's say, 1920. And then there's other things in other, usually different museums, although it can be sometimes the same museums, which were found archaeologically by modern archaeological processes. And inevitably, those 2 different ways of finding things are going to lead to different results. So what do you think, Scal, would be the motivations for choosing to put certain things in your museum cabinets if you were a museum curator?
Well, it can be a number of different criteria. It can be either something that's particularly representative of a lot of items of the time, doesn't even have to be weapons, or it can be something particularly exceptional. You know, say a piece made for the Duke of wherever, it's particularly precious and ornamented. I mean, usually they do both, but yeah, something that is particularly well preserved, perhaps, so that people get a better idea of what it used to look like back in the day.
Yeah,
a number of criteria you can go about. In some cases, you can't really cherry pick too much. Like, you know, we mentioned already, Iron Age blades often are just not very well preserved.
Yeah, so, and I think, you know, different museums have different raison d'etre. They have a different sort of mission statement. So a really good example I think a lot of people would visit if they were a tourist and went to Paris would be the Louvre. And if you go to the Louvre, you can see swords which were allegedly owned by Charlemagne, and the coronation sword of the French kings and this kind of stuff. And clearly, that is a very different type of sword. That is a very different selection criteria to if you go to the Museum of London. Their sort of raison d'etre is to show things that have been, for the most part, archaeologically found in London. So it might have been pulled out of the River Thames 20 years ago by an archaeologist or a metal detectorist. So those 2 things are almost completely incomparable, because, you know, the coronation sword of the French kings is not going to show a lot of edge damage because it wasn't used in combat, and it was looked after. And, you know, in that specific example, it had a new hilt added to it, and then it had a new scabbard made for it by the Holy Roman Emperors, and various other, you know, has very different levels of interaction with humans over the centuries, to something which was maybe carried in London in the 15th century and then accidentally dropped off a bridge or a barge when someone was, you know, moving around in their daily life. And also different status levels as well, you know.
Depends on the audience, definitely. I remember going to a university museum that was more geared toward archaeologists. So you saw things that were not really cherry picked, but just like, they might sort them by typology, and you would see a lot that is just not very well preserved, but this is what they found, and sorted by geographical area and all that. And the further you go back in time, the more difficult it gets, of course, to assign labels, because, this is the such and such culture, based on ceramic, and, it can be difficult to even connect that with anything we know from historical sources, because maybe there weren't any.
Yeah. So I think the basic answer is that yes, there are swords in museums which have been restored, that have sometimes been enhanced. As I mentioned to you when we were talking about this before filming, I know of at least one example in the Wallace collection, for example, famous arms and armor collection, that is made of parts. So the assumption, and this was only found out, in fact, when Dr. Capwell was working there, it was found out through X-ray that the hilt parts didn't match the tang at all, and also I think it's called radiospectrography or something like that, where you look at the material makeup of the metals, that probably the crossguard was a 19th century replacement in the style of. And so what they've done is they cherry picked some parts. They've gone, okay, we've got a nice blade, we've got a crossguard we can fabricate in the style of, and we've got a really nice original pommel. So some of the parts are original. The grip is a 19th century replacement, and then they've been put together in the 19th century to create this beautiful 15th century style arming sword that looks fantastic. And it does look like ones we know are 100% genuine. It was well researched and based on existing ones, but it's not genuine. So obviously with a sword like that, we're not going to expect to see evidence of edge damage, because that blade was specifically cherry picked because it was in wonderfully nice condition, and it was then repolished as well. So even if it had any edge, slight edge nicks, they would have been polished out. So you've got that kind of level of things. And then I mentioned, the coronation swords, or the ducal, if we go to like Poland, for example, there's certain swords in Poland which have great sort of national significance. So they probably were carried in wars, actually, but they have been repeatedly enhanced and restored and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's another thing. You can have modifications or enhancements from a later time that's still historical. Like, for example, say you have a medieval blade that's then being modified during the Baroque or whatever, and it's still, to us, it's still historical, but it's no longer original.
Yeah, and a famous example is, and this is turned out to be controversial, is the sword of William Wallace at Stirling Castle, which is not at all original. It's like definitely not the sword of William Wallace, but X-ray has shown that the blade is made of different parts. So it seems to be like 2 or maybe 3 sword blades welded together, and who knows, maybe one of those parts was a sword that actually was William Wallace's sword. We don't know. But then the hilt, we have actual records of when that hilt was made for it in the 17th century. So, the hilt is a complete, but it is historical in a sense, in that, it's been in that kind of shape since the 17th century, I think. James Elmsley has actually done quite a lot of research on this, and I'm going to do a video with him about it at some point. But the point is, it is an old sword. It's just not what it says it is on the label, so those swords aside, the next thing is we do have genuine medieval and Renaissance swords in collections which are honest, which don't have edge damage on them. It could just be that they weren't used. And one of the points I've always made is that the vast majority of swords in history were never actually used to kill anyone, and they were probably never used in a fight.
Particularly if you have a sword or any weapon really that's carried for self-defense. Generally, the idea is it's better to have not need it and have it than need it and not have it. But hopefully, you'll never have to use it. Right? You carry it, you take good care of it. But if everything goes well, you're not going to actually use it. Whereas weapons used on the battlefield might have ended up in a ditch. They might have ended up with corpses buried because they were too damaged and they didn't bother. They might have been stolen and repurposed or repaired or broken and reforged, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And, in this period, we've got sort of civilian weapons and war weapons, and those two things can be separate things or they can be overlapping things. So obviously, if you're a gentleman in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, your arming sword or your rapier or whatever, you might take to war with you, or you might have a civilian sword and you might have a war sword. So you might have, say, 5 swords, 10 swords, and one of those might have been to war with you and might have been used, but the sword that you actually spend most of your life wearing, the one that you wear around in the streets, well, you got in some arguments, but you never actually, that duel never quite happened, and you were ready to use it, you were trained to use it, but you didn't actually use it. Or in some cases, even if you had one duel, how much edge damage, a real fight, how long is it going to last? Maybe that fight lasted 30 seconds, 1 minute. How many times did your blade actually collide with the other person's blade? Maybe you lunged, they ducked, you moved around, maybe you made one parry and then you stabbed them through the face and they were like, oh, okay, that's the end of the duel kind of thing. The guy's like, okay, I'm sorry. End of the fight. Well, how much edge damage did your sword pick up? None, really. Maybe one small nick, polish it out, gone. So... And then even in war, obviously ideal in 19th century swords a lot of the time. And many of those, I mean, I've got swords behind me that I categorically know because I know who owned them because of the serial numbers and stuff, that they were carried in war. I've got swords behind me that were carried in the siege of Delhi, the siege of Lucknow, that were carried at, the Crimean, in the Crimean War. And some of them do have some damage. But just because something's carried in war doesn't mean that it's going to meet other things in use that will actually damage it. And some do.
Especially at a time when firearms were that prevalent.
Yeah, and some do. And, one of the swords behind me was, I've done a video about it years ago, was carried during the Maori Wars, the New Zealand Land Wars. But his previous sword, he broke on a Russian officer's head at the siege of Sebastopol in 1854 or 5, I can't remember, 55, I think. And because we have the written account, and he was actually bayoneted and taken prisoner by the Russians. But before that, he took out a Russian officer in a one-on-one fight, but his sword broke on the guy's head, and that's why he bought the new sword, because when he was freed from captivity, he got back to London, and after recuperating, he bought a new sword, and then he went off to New Zealand. So he did carry that sword in on campaign. He'd broken a previous sword, but that sword doesn't show any damage. It's in wonderful condition, still got a sharp edge, beautifully mirror polished, and so he carried it in war, but probably never actually hit anyone with it. And it never met another sword because, well, he was fighting against Maoris. And even if he had got into hand-to-hand combat, there wouldn't be any signs of damage on the blade anyway. So, so there are so many unknowns. But you did ask me something about selection bias of the museum curators, I think. Do they sometimes... Do you want to articulate that yourself? Because I think that...
Yeah, the question of whether they look at a used sword perhaps and think, nobody wants to see a beaten up whole thing. Let's put out the nice, pristine, well-preserved, well-cared for one and leave the beater in the back.
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes, that does sometimes happen. And I know of a couple of swords at the Royal Armouries in Leeds which are not on display, even though they are really historically significant, because they're actually too fragile. And I think that's it's not always about necessarily what looks great. It's sometimes about, well, we have to handle these things, we have to move them around. Sometimes archaeologically found swords that are the most damaged are also the most fragile. And so there's one of the Castillon swords, it's a falchion, in fact. And I believe the reason that's not on display, even though it's a really interesting sword, and a few people have replicated it, is because it's really fragile to move around. So it's safely in a drawer in the storeroom. And you can go and look at it, but it's not on display. And they've got one of the other Castillon swords, which I think potentially shows combat edge damage on it as well. It has a chip out of the edge. And that one, I'm not fully sure. I don't honestly know why that one's not on display, because to my reckoning, it's not that fragile. I know that Peter Johnson studied it and done a beautiful replica of it. I don't know why that's not on display. So sometimes there are reasons why curators and museum staff decide to put certain things on display and certain things not, that are more subtle than necessarily just it looks good, or, you know.
It could even be as trivial as they have limited space and they have way too much stored.
100%, yeah.
Could be as simple as that.
Yeah, the Victoria and Albert Museum famously in, I think it was 1979, if I remember correctly, they put most of their sword collection away in storage, and that's where most of it has remained, which I think I've always thought is a great shame. And in recent years, they've brought some of them back out and put them on display, but they've still got a lot in storage. So I think it's difficult. I think the kind of headline answer is, I think it's really difficult making a conclusion about edge damage on swords based on what you see in museums, because remember, what you see in museums isn't always necessarily representative of what they got in storage, and their reasons for having certain things in storage and certain things on display are sometimes complicated. And also, I would say sometimes there's edge damage that people don't recognize. So I've handled certain swords that I've been studying or measuring or whatever, and I've noticed things on them that I never, in years of seeing them in cabinets, I just never noticed, to do with asymmetry, to do with some of their construction. I was looking at Cinque Dea. In fact, I've got one of the prototypes, Cinque Dea from the Royal Armouries. This is the windlass prototype, and the way that the guard is constructed is in several parts, and they're forge welded together. And I didn't notice, I never ever would have noticed that. If it was on display flat in the cabinet, you'd never notice that. But only when you're handling the thing and looking at it from different angles do you notice these kind of details. And the other thing you notice when you're able to hold an example and look along it, you'll often notice that blades are bent or twisted that you can't see when they're flat in the cabinet. And sometimes you can see the edge meanders, and that's clearly because of resharpening and rehoning. And that's something that you touched on, that they've clearly taken edge damage and they have filed it out, because that point is a stress riser. So if you want to keep using that sword, you want to get rid of that stress riser as much as you can.
Yeah, and sometimes you have damage that's not obvious, at least in pictures, because oftentimes blades would bend simply, particularly if you have softer steel or even iron. It's much more likely than with reproductions now. I've definitely seen some where, like, at first when you look at them from the front, straight on, we see the flat, like, okay, it seems pristine, and you walk around and you see like there's like an S curve in it, or it's otherwise like really off, and it's pretty significant. And there might even be marks on the flat that you don't necessarily see at first, because somebody did manage to parry with the flat, or there's otherwise contact, and it bended but didn't actually chip it significantly. The other blade might have been chipped.
So basically, I wanted to thank you for asking this question, because it's been a springboard actually for me to think about some of my observations over the years and put it into a coherent form to answer the question. And I think, to sort of conclude, my view is that yes, what you see in museums is curated. I mean, the pure sense of the word, it is chosen. This is selected for various reasons. Sometimes things in museums have been altered, restored, enhanced. Sometimes they are fakes. There are fakes in museums. But also, if we look more at the archaeological examples, so some museums have a lot more archaeological examples than necessarily bought in auction 100 years ago examples. And the archaeological examples do tend to show more damage and more genuine, obviously, evidence of combat than the kind of looked after examples. And yeah, so I think, and also if you're actually able to get in there and look at the things, as you say, more closely yourself, you notice things that you just never would have normally noticed in the museum cabinet. And the edge damage is out there, and the damage on guards. I've even seen cut on a pommel, which is nice, because I've seen that happen in HEMA. I'm sure you have as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you mess up the parry and it
Yeah.
ends up on the grip or the
Yeah.
pommel, or
It always makes me
especially with
laugh.
messers, because they're so long, they have such a long grip.
Yeah. It always makes me laugh actually when I parry accidentally, basically. But when I mess up my parry, but the blade lands like between, like with
Oh yeah, in
longsword, when
between
it
the hand,
lands
yeah.
between your hands, it's like, whoa, that
Close
that
call.
worked, but exactly, you never could have planned that, but it worked, And so you do end up with, damage in strange places on the hilt and stuff. And you showed a good example of that rapier with edge damage, but you see it on, like I say, on guards and pommels and other places as well. So it is there. I just think that people often don't notice it. And the other thing to remember is sometimes the edge damage is there, and as I mentioned, it's been removed,
Yeah.
polished out, filed out, perhaps in period, not by modern museum people, but
Yeah.
by the original owner. So that sometimes you really have to know what you're looking for, and that's why
And even then it can be difficult. I
yeah,
mean, I remember the one Bauernwehr that I tested, that I got damaged and sent it back to the maker, and he repaired it and sent, I was looking at it. I would, even though I knew that it was damaged,
yeah,
when I saw what he did with it, I couldn't tell
yeah,
because he had blended it in. So in some cases you can see it, like with some bronze daggers that have a wide base, but then have a weirdly narrow blade. So you can tell that they've been resharpened and repaired so many times that they've just removed a lot of material, but it can be hard to see.
And like I mentioned when we were talking before, 100% this happens with Japanese weapons, with katana, tachi, naginata. It happens with all of them because they lose chips from the edge actually quite easily if they hit other hard objects, because they're very, very brittle, but they're very hard. And it's just completely normal in Japan to just have the blade essentially reground, hand ground and repolished by a togishi. Completely, they don't even think twice about it. It's just standard
Yeah,
practice.
it's not a big deal because that's how they resharpen too.
Yeah.
Like in order to resharpen a katana, you grind the entire, like you regrind the entire thing.
Yeah.
Basically, you can't just, as with a monosteel sword, just, okay, I'm going to grind this a little bit, file that, just slightly blend it in. That's it. You have to go the whole way.
Yeah. 100%. So anyway, thanks once again for coming on, Skal. It's been awesome to have you on here. This should have happened years ago, so it's great that we've got together, and hopefully we'll. I think if the viewers would like me and Skal to look at other topics in the future, that would be very welcome. And we've had a really good chat, and I'd love to do that again. So thanks for watching, and thanks to Skal for coming on.
Thank you too,
Obviously.
Matt.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. And if you haven't seen Skal's video yet, which I hope you have done anyway, but if you haven't, then check out that link below, and give us a like for the algorithm. And we'll both see you on both our channels really soon. Cheers for watching, and thanks, Skal.
Take care.
Cheers.